Okay, hello, welcome to the How to Text in Another Language session. My name is Gretchen McCulloch. I am an internet linguist, so I analyze internet language, and just as an administrative note, there's a short URL link to these slides on the last slide, so if you're thinking, oh man, I wish I had that, you don't have to take a low-resolution photo, you can actually access all of the slides at this nice URL that will go up at the end. So the frame that I want to talk about this question is, what makes texting or in general, internet types of conversations, whether that's tweets or posts on Facebook or Instagram or all sorts of things, in another language or in a language you're interested in, different from other kinds of speaking or writing that you might do that is the more conventional fare of a language learning classroom, where they will, try to teach you, okay, here's how you write a letter, a business letter, or like, here's how you write a postcard, and maybe they'll try to teach you how to write an email, but sometimes they'll teach you weird things in an email that is not actually how speakers do it, because the materials might be from like the 90s, and they're like, yes, dear sir, have you received my fax? So what do you need to think about when you're trying to figure out how can you actually text like somebody who's using this language? What do speakers of this language do, and how can you not kind of be the person who's going into, let's say you're learning English, because that's the language I can assume people in this room speak, CUL8R, and using outdated slang from the 90s. How do you figure out what people are actually doing now? And so when I talk, so I'm interested in internet language and how we use, what makes communication specifically different about language online. And I like to draw some boxes here. So we often talk about language skills on this kind of dichotomy between spoken and written communication. But I think we actually need to break those things up, because there are several different things that you can mean when you're talking about either speech or writing. And man, it is distracting to have the doors at the front. It's not your fault, but it's just weird from a speaker perspective. So one thing, when we talk about speech, we often assume that all speech is just conversational speech. All speech is this back and forth, like having your conversation. But there's a formal genre of speech, like the speech that I'm doing right now. I don't go home and talk to my dog like this. I don't have a dog. If I did, I wouldn't go home and talk to my dog like this. I don't go home and talk to my dog with like a PowerPoint presentation, and like, here's this extended discourse on internet linguistics, except for the fact that maybe I need to practice this speech with my dog. So formal speech is practiced. It contains conventionalized expressions like, ladies and gentlemen, or, like, please put your hands together for our next speaker, or these types of routinized things that aren't necessarily part of the informal language. And writing also has formal and informal genres. And so often the kind of writing that you're trying to read, that we're most exposed to, is this formal sort of writing that's books and newspapers and other sorts of formal bits. But the informal style of writing that you do on your phones, or you do in text messages, or you do in other types of things like that, has different properties to it, and even in English, those properties aren't necessarily discussed as being their own thing or as being a continuum for stuff. So this is how I like to look at the question of how do you text in another language, is what does this informal written genre look like? And sometimes that can be postcards or other types of, or diary entries, or notes that you might leave somebody, grocery lists, but that can also be texts and posts on social media, anything that doesn't go through an editor. So a big place where this shows up is because you have informal plus writing, is that internet writing often tends to be more in the vernacular. It represents things that are spoken or that are colloquial that aren't in the formal standardized version of the language that gets recorded in, that gets taught in schools or gets recorded in newspapers or gets controlled by editors. So And this can mean both writing a different register of the language or writing a different, things that are closer to the way things are spoken. So in English, you see this with things like writing dunno instead of I don't know, or I do not know, which is closer to the way that many people actually pronounce I don't know. If you say it as dunno, you can also write D-U-N-N-O, and there's a convention that dunno is written with, say, 2 N's, right? And that the schwa there, that first vowel, is written with a U. It could be written with an O, it could be written with 1 N, but the convention is, for this particular bit of informal language, that's how it's written in this particular context. And so you need to know, okay, this is informal, this is how people write this particular representation of the spoken thing. And so you're left with this big question of, okay, say you're an English speaker and you're trying to figure out, say you're learning English and you're trying to figure out, how is it that I know how people write these versions like dunno? How do I know, even if I have heard people say things like that, how do I know how people write the vernacular forms? And one way that you can find this, so let's use French as a case study because I speak French, so French has a famously elaborate relationship between the orthography and what's actually said. In other words, it has a lot of silent letters. And in the vernacular, and just a reminder that these slides are all going to be available at the end, so you can take a photo if you want to, but you can actually access the URLs. There's all these silent letters in conventional French, and in vernacular French, a lot of these letters that are even pronounced in the formal version, something like tu sais, oh look, you pronounce that U, the S at the end is silent, but at least you're pronouncing the U in tu, becomes more like tse. Pronounced more like tse. So these 2 lines are tse, j'te, j'suis, j't'avais, j'te, quand, and say. So the name of the letter is say. Since both of these are silent in the first place, you can just sort of pronounce this as say. But the question that comes to mind is, how do you know whether people are actually using these particular respellings versus any other potential candidate respellings that somebody could be using? So, in English back in the 90s, people were writing, the letter G, the letter R, and the number 8 for great. But now if you write that, you don't come across as someone who's down with the youth slang. You come across as somebody who's stuck in the 90s. I mean, people now use GR8 ironically, but so you might be that level. How do you know if this is actually the slang people are using now versus the slang they were using back when your language textbook was written, which was probably already the kind of thing that 40-year-olds who write language textbooks were aware of at the time? I learned some highly suspicious French slang in high school that I have never used because my 50-year-old French teacher was like, this is how you talk. And we were all, even at the time, do you? If any French speaker has ever actually used sagaz, which is apparently like how's it going, what's up, but I've never actually heard someone do this, possibly because it may be France slang, it's not Quebec slang. Okay, it is definitely not Quebec slang. I've lived in Montreal for 8 years, and I've never heard anybody say this. But my French teacher was he was from France, he was convinced that this was the hip slang that we needed to know. So, you can't always trust teachers because it depends on what demographic they belong to. They may not know what the youth of their own country are saying right now, for the same reason that, your parents may not know what the youth are saying right now, and it's not their fault. You just need to find some more youth. So one way to do this, especially in the written internet-mediated context, is Twitter. So I started with this last night, because I admit my French texting slang is actually not that good. I don't text very much in French, and when I do write in French, it's formal emails. But I knew this one word, c'est, is how you represent tu sais. And so I started with that on Twitter. And my first problem was that I started getting results for the Toronto Stock Exchange. The TSE. And also some stuff in I'm not sure which languages, so Osage, maybe, and possibly also a language of Nigeria that I don't speak. Um, and so, one thing you may want to do is, if you're trying to find slang, and particularly because slang words are often very short, they're often very abbreviated, they can stand for multiple things in multiple languages, let's just say. So you can add in a common function word. So I tried le and la, and that still gave me too much stuff from other languages. So I ended up with mon, which means my, because, okay, sure, like, at least this will get us towards something that has some other French words in it, if you pick some other very common French words, and hopefully they don't also have conventionalized respellings in text speak. So you may have to kind of cycle through a few. But at least with mon, okay, this one's in French. Well, it's kind of in a combination of French and English. C'est quand j'étais sur mon autre account, puis tu were like, when j'utilisais juste mon autre account. If you speak any French, you may notice this is not conventionally how you type French. And the reason why I'm not like embedding these tweets in is because I don't want to say like, this is an ordinary person, right? Which is why we're interested, but it's also like I don't want to embed that person's ordinary tweets out of context. But this gives us something which, for example, is j'étais. So if we do another search for c'est and j'étais, you get more. Okay, here's some more, French slang results. And so you can kind of end up down this rabbit hole, and eventually you can get so far as je suis, quand, and c'est. Mes selfies quand je suis bourré, c'est les mieux. My selfies when I'm drunk are the best. So you can kind of use one piece of slang. I didn't know that that QD stood for quand when I started looking at this. I just knew say, and I kind of followed this rabbit hole down. Okay, here are some other things, and in context, QD must be quand there. Even if I saw it in a couple other tweets and I was like, I'm not sure what QD stands for here, quand je sors, but it makes sense if you have a couple of them and you see them in context, how are people actually using these? And so looking at how are people actually using them in context is kind of the biggest takeaway of this. I will leave a couple of those other ones up, but I'm going to make you go back to full screen. So yeah, so kind of going through different examples for context. And so I'm going to walk through some other examples here in shorter form to give an idea of other things that you might want to look for when you're trying to figure out what are people actually doing when they're texting here. How do I sound like somebody of the age that I actually am, rather than somebody of an age that I am not? So another thing to look for is letter replacement, which happens in various languages. So languages that don't actually use K in the orthography sometimes use K in text speak because it sounds like it seems cooler. Languages that don't use X sometimes use X in text speak because, like, hey, it's right there on the keyboard, like, what if we replace this here? A caveat about using Twitter data. So on the one hand, Twitter's a really interesting place to go because it's public, you can see it, and especially if you see in people's replies and kind of ordinary conversations, you can do it. But this is from a study about Indonesian tweets versus texts. And I bring it up partly because, like, hey, it's interesting to see some Indonesian because, a lot of these internet language studies happen on English. But you can see, for example, that, so sip, which I hope I'm saying correctly, is the Indonesian word for yes. And people speaking Indonesian, just like speakers of many languages with alphabets, repeat letters to indicate sort of emphasis. So you might write yes with a lot of S's. Does somebody have a question? some of that. It's but what's interesting is that you actually see more words, like tweets tend to use more words, while texts use fewer words. So from a length perspective, they both have different kinds of length constraints and they different kinds of things that people reply to. And a lot of text, depending on your phone, may also have character limits, or at least originally had character limits. People may have some sort of character limit in mind as well. The argument that these researchers use is that texts are less formal in general on all metrics than tweets are. So people are talking in public, they tend to be a little bit more formal. So even if you're finding stuff on tweets, it's still worth keeping in mind that it may not represent exactly how people text. It can just be kind of a way into a particular thing. But if you have someone to text within a language, you can just ask them. It's just kind of getting into beginning to understand that. So people tend to use more lengthening in text versus tweets, and people still do, repeat letters to lengthen them in tweets, just not as often. They tend to use, again, but here's a shorter version. This is a shorter version of the word for negation. They tend to use more non-standard forms in text. People tend to use make their tweets longer than their text, use more subordinate clauses in tweets, and generally use more standard word order. So these are kind of things to look at, even among things that are both in an internet language sort of context. Here are a couple other things. So languages that are written in a non-Roman orthography also sometimes, especially from the history of, based on the history of computers which didn't have very good support for non-Roman orthographies initially, sometimes have romanizations that are common. You could do a whole talk about the Arabic chat alphabet, which I am not going to do. Is somebody else doing it? But I wanted to point people to the Wikipedia article, at least as a way to get started, because one of its interesting features is the use of numbers for particular letters that look like those letters. So where is an example here? So the end of this word, which this looks kind of like a 7, a little bit. At least it looks more like a 7 than it does like any of the other letters that he doesn't correspond to. So, being aware that there are various other types of things there, it's a really interesting system, but you could talk about it for a whole half an hour. So, another big domain to look into is how people in a particular language express what I call typographical tone of voice. So how they use respellings and punctuation and capitalization to convey a particular expression. So for example, languages that use, kind of alphabets that have a capital and a lowercase often use the capitals and the lowercase to stand for something different. So in English, for example, we often use all caps to indicate shouting. But in a language where you don't have a case distinction in your letters, you can't use all caps to indicate shouting. I've been told that some speakers of Japanese switch from hiragana to katakana to convey a difference in emphasis there, if they want to do that, if any speakers of Japanese would like to verify this. I've been also told by some Hebrew speakers that they're really annoyed that they don't have a capitals because sometimes they want to shout. And this one bilingual person was like, yeah, I don't know, normally we don't need capitals, but it'd be really convenient to be able to shout. So, there are various options there. Many languages use alphabet use repeating letters, but if you don't have a system where one symbol stands for one sound approximately, unless you're French, how do you convey length? So if you don't have repeating letters like English and Indonesian do, another option is the tilde or wave dash. And so this started in Japanese, but it's common in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, but even languages like Tagalog and Singlish that use the Roman orthography use the tilde sometimes to indicate lengthening. So instead of writing tilde e, you can write it tilde wave dash or wave dash, wave dash, wave dash. So the tilde and the wave dash are basically the same thing, except that the wave dash is written in the full width character set, and the tilde is written in non-full width character set, in case this is an encoding thing that interests you. But it basically depends on which keyboard you're using. So this gets kind of picked up. So the tilde is used for other stuff as well, and it sometimes gets picked up by people who are fans of like Japanese cultural exports, like manga and anime, who use the tilde to kind of connote this sort of kawaii interpretation without realizing that initially it stood for lengthening a word. Another big one is laughter in different languages. So in English, you may be aware of, ha 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 ha, LOL. There's this great Reddit thread that became an Atlantic article from a couple years ago, asking people, like, how do you laugh in your language online? And some of my favorites are the ones that represent what seem to us like slightly different sounds. So Korean, apparently, KKKKK is more common than HHHH, even though they do use both. In Spanish, obviously the J makes the h sound, so it's pretty close to ha 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 ha. But definitely when I first saw that, as somebody who knows some German and some Spanish, I was like, oh, they're just saying yeah, 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 yeah. Which is not actually what they're saying. It is laughter. It is not yes. Just don't make the mistake I did. In Thai, apparently the number 5 is pronounced ha. So if you write ha 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 ha, it's like laughter. Greek, okay, so the X is going to be pronounced kind of like ha ha. Anyway, Japanese apparently has this W from the word for laughter. People use. Mandarin is just representing ha, which is nice. Hebrew, again, ha, kind of sort of sound. French has this interesting thing, so you have, a bunch of representations of laughter. But also MDR, mort de rire, which means like dead of laughter, is the kind of their equivalent of LOL. And I was suspicious of this because this was one of the ones that I learned in school, and I was always like, is this fake though? But when I was doing the earlier kind of Twitter dive and looking at people using shte and say, I did see a few MDRs, so I'm more confident about it than I was before I started putting this presentation together. Although I would still say, I think I've been told they also just use LOL. So.
Well, the old one, like,
okay,
yeah.
It's like an older thing?
Yeah, it's an older
Yeah. Oh, okay. We have disagreement. Great.
I feel like you have to remember typing, like texting on a computer.
Oh, it's not a phone thing.
Well, if
You have to be using it on.
text a computer, you know that.
Oh, okay. If you started texting on a phone, it might just say LOL. If you started texting on a computer, you might use MDR. Is that consistent with you?
Some younger people in university who still use it. It's definitely not a majority.
Okay.
It's not unheard of even on, let's say, younger than 30.
Okay, so there's some disagreement even among speakers who are saying, some people use it, but maybe it's a little bit older than some of the other expressions. Maybe it's kind of like using lol but in all caps to mean like actual laughter versus LOL just as the I'm not angry at you one. So like both people use them, but it depends on what you mean by it. So if anyone who speaks Brazilian Portuguese would like to tell me what this RS thing stands for. Is it like risos or something? Anyway. So there are a bunch of them. Keep an eye out for laughter. It is not always just ha 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 ha. There are lots of them. And you can't always be convinced that just because a language may have something that looks like an H, it is actually an H that you laugh with. I want to talk also briefly about emoji and related things, which I talk about. I have a whole analysis of emoji as gesture, but I want to talk about very briefly some differences in emoji. So here's a difference between how people represent plain text emotions. In English and a lot of cultures that are influenced by kind of Western cartoons, you can keep the eyes the same and you change the mouth, and that changes the emotional valence of what you're saying. I think everyone hopefully here knows what these mean. Happy and sad? Okay, great, just checking. Okay, in Japanese and languages that are influenced by manga and anime, you can keep the mouth the same and just change the eyes. And this is what creates the difference between happy and sad in this case. Either of these systems work fine. The problem is when you have something like this, where you have what are very clearly happy eyes and what is very clearly not actually that happy of a mouth, and you have people who are approaching this image from two different visual emotion conventions, and you end up with problems like this study that came out in 2016, where they asked people to rate, these were English speakers, they asked people to rate what are all ostensibly the same emoji as they displayed differently on different platforms. And you can see that Apple is way over here at like, oh, this isn't very positive, because these are English speakers, they're looking at that grimacing mouth and they're not looking at the smiling eyes. Whereas these platforms that make the mouth and the eyes more congruent are all rated over here at positive. So, you know, keeping an eye on, so fortunately, since 2016, when the study came out, Apple has now updated its emoji to make the mouth and the eyes more congruous, because people are looking at different symbols, different parts of the symbol, even when it's ostensibly the same symbol. Even if you're sending and receiving the same thing, if you're operating based on Japanese conventions versus English conventions, you're going to potentially read this very differently, depending on whether you interpret the smiling eyes as smiling. So this is something to kind of be aware of, although hopefully it's becoming a little bit less of a problem. But in general, emoji can sometimes stand for different things in different languages, and this is more common than emoji boosterism media would have you believe, because particularly people who use emoji for things like wordplay or this kind of stuff, it is often a lot more language specific than seems necessarily the case from here's a bunch of symbols. Lastly, I want to talk about tech-related vocabulary, aka words to be suspicious of when you're presented with them in language learning resources. And for this, I want to talk about a case study. So we already talked about this kind of MDR example, and like, I think my initial suspicion of like, do the kids really say this was probably well-founded. But another example of this is, so I was having some fun with Duolingo in Dutch, as you do. Have we not all been there? And they present me with the vocabulary item sms'je, so that's the diminutive je, and SMS being a text message. And I'm like, that's very interesting. I am immediately suspicious of this word because it's related to technology, and who knows if like 3 or 5 years ago, when somebody was developing this language learning module for this app, if it's still the same. So, you know, any tech-related word, just immediately a little bit suspicious. And especially what I'm suspicious of is this apostrophe, because as this word became more common, it seems really plausible that maybe people started dropping the apostrophe. And then maybe like the formal version you learn in the language learning app is not necessarily what people are actually saying. So I take it to Twitter, I'm searching for SMSU with the apostrophe and SMSU without the apostrophe, and like sure enough, yeah, there seem to be more people using it without the apostrophe, so I feel like very proud of myself and I've learned something. And of course, the story doesn't end there. So I say this to a Dutch speaker friend who I'm saying, like, hey, look, I've learned this word. It seems suspicious, though, because it's related to technology. And my friend's like, yeah, that is the word for an SMS. But actually, Dutch people all use WhatsApp now. No one uses real text messages. And when you're talking about a WhatsApp message, it is not an SMS-je, it's an app-je. A regular app is like an app on your phone, but like an app-je, the diminutive, is specifically a WhatsApp message. So you got the right word for SMS-je, it's just that nobody uses SMS anymore. So I was correct to be suspicious, but Twitter sleuthing could only get me so far. So also checking these types of things with, you know, how can you find domain-specific vocabulary? And you can't get this in something like Google Translate at all, because they put in something like text message, and it gives you like a text, like a, written literary text, and then like a message that you send someone, and that this is not what people want. And the social context for what North Americans mean when they say a text is often kind of generic term for a messaging app, whereas the generic term for a messaging app in different areas is not necessarily a text message. The last thing that I want to do is do a bit of crowdsourcing, because I think there's probably other things from other languages that people have come across in this room of, we've got about 15 minutes left for, we could do a Q&A, but the specific version of the Q&A that I want to do is, what are specific examples of things that you've encountered that you didn't expect, or that's in a language that you know a bit, and saying, like, here's a thing that people might want to be aware of so that other people can learn other things about texting in other languages. So I should have warned about that question at the beginning, because you could have started thinking about these things. But yeah, so we have a mic to pass around for that.
It's kind of catching me off guard, but I remember offhand when I was in China last summer, and there's an entire code of texting that's developing among the youth using alternate characters with about the same pronunciation to say something different. And I'm racking my brains right now trying to find a few examples for you. But some of them are really funny because they will give an entirely different meaning, something usually very funny or naughty or
Yeah, there's the grass mud horse one, right?
Well, hush, yeah. Social harmony, river crab.
Yeah. Yeah, there's one that's obscene, but it also sounds like something else. Yeah, there are a bunch of these with puns you can do that's like the same sounds but with different tones. And so you can use that as a way to replace that. So that's taking advantage of language-specific resources, which is Chinese has tones. And so you can replace particular things there to do puns with tones.
Well, and you have a different reason for doing it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it gets deleted from WeChat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. It's part of the motivation behind that is to kind of go around the censorship in trying to say it without actually saying it and saying something entirely different. I don't know how fast censorship is going to adapt to that, but for now it seems to be okay.
Yeah. So yeah, people using stuff to get around censors as well. Yeah.
I have something, but would that be Voldemorting?
Yeah, it would kind of be Voldemorting.
I realized that I was using like asterisks and other non-letters characters to express stuff like shouting or to like emphasis or things when Messenger starting doing things with it. So if you put something between asterisks, it's going to be in bold or something on italics. Or is it used on other platforms to express stuff like all caps, or like do people do that, or is it just me and my friends?
People definitely use all caps all over the place.
But like putting things between two asterisks. Or
Do you use the asterisks more because it turns it into bold, or use it
I've
less because it
stopped
turns it?
using
Yeah, this is the one that I've. Yeah, this is what I hear from a lot of people, and especially the one that I really hate is on WhatsApp when you use tildes. It creates a strike through, and I'm like, that's not what I meant here. Like, I wanted to use the tildes for sarcasm, and now you're trying to like make me delete this whole make me look like I'm trying to delete this whole phrase. Like, people who are designing this have no idea how people are actually using the product. Is kind of where I think that goes. Yeah, so people use. I mean, this is not as cross-linguistic, so I didn't put it in this talk, but it's in the book that I wrote. So yeah, different platforms doing using asterisks for bold, which I think you can do in pretty much, or asterisks for calling attention to something. I think you can do that in pretty much any language, as long as you can type an asterisk. But it's possible that not all languages use the asterisk convention. I haven't verified this in all of them. We have another.
Yeah, just wanted to support what she said. When I write with, I guess, emphasis, yes, I would sort of put two asterisks around either a phrase or a word to convey, I guess, intonation or irony or sarcasm. I would just write it in square brackets, the word sarcasm or irony, because sometimes when you're writing, there's a particular tone of voice you're using, but sometimes you can't convey irony in in writing or sarcasm in writing. And so to, make it a point, I would just either put that at the end of what I wanted to say or put it at the very beginning of what I wanted to say, either square brackets irony, square brackets sarcasm, or
I've seen people
whatever.
put like commentary hashtags for that as well, like hashtag sarcasm, hashtag
Yeah,
irony,
that too.
or like slash sarcasm or slash s sometimes, slash ironically, or like end rant. So using kind of fake code tags or fake like things like that in a dialogue conversation where obviously like the hashtag isn't going to work.
Or a winking emoji, like to say
Yeah,
this is a
winking
joke.
emoji, these kinds of things. Where obviously the hashtag isn't going to work, but like it can kind of create the bit to emphasize sarcasm. Question in the back?
About the asterisks, that I put a little bit of input here. I personally have a massive issue with the whole bold thing, because if anyone has some sort of background with role playing, you usually use that to enact something. So you would put it between asterisks to be like kisses or hugs or something, like I am doing this, like actively doing it. So whenever I try to do that kind of thing and it just turns into bold, I'm like, no, this was not my intention. Why would you do this to me? So that's a little interesting.
Yeah, people use the like third person self narration, like sighs or laughs or frowns or grins or something, especially. Sometimes on platforms that I know automatically make it bold, I'll add an extra space or something to try to like prevent the bold from taking over. But I agree.
I also wanted to add just a little thing about just, I guess, the evolution of the whole laughing thing. I feel like there was a time when you could just LOL, and that was fine, and then there was like LMAO, which I'm not going to translate fully. Probably everybody knows what it means. But it feels to me like when I first started using that, I imagine, well, a good 10 years ago probably, you could just put LOL, and then if you wanted to emphasize this, you would just repeat the last L, or eventually put it in caps, and also repeat the last L. So there were different degrees of emphasis you could add. But recently I've been seeing a lot of people just, as you mentioned earlier, LOL, and double it. And I have no idea where this came from. And that's one thing just that I find was very interesting. And last input, and then I can give the mic, I'm sorry, about the whole MDR, mort de rire. I do see that very often among French speakers from France. Very often, and some of them tend to repeat the last R just like you would with LOL.
Okay.
So I do see that a ton. In
Do
Quebec,
people
though, I do not.
Oh, so maybe
not.
that's why I don't see it, because I'm in French in Quebec. Do people say it in conversation and stuff as well? 'Cause some people say lol in conversation, depending on what demographic you're in. You may say lol in conversation. Do people say MDR, like, in conversation, or is it mostly a written thing to you?
I thought
No?
that was going to be like blasphemy, but I've heard it.
Okay.
I have. But yeah, definitely mostly among a little bit younger people, I'd say between like 18, 21, 22, I've been seeing a lot of that. And yes, I have been seeing people saying it verbally, but again, just people from France.
I had a French speaker, and I was doing I was talking about internet linguistics and LOL and how it doesn't really stand for laughing out loud anymore. Like if you say to someone, I hate you, lol, doesn't mean like I hate you and I'm laughing about it. It means like I'm joking about hating you, and like the laughter is just sort of incidental to the joke. And the French speaker who had heard me talking about this was like, wow, I never realized, I've seen people use lol, but I didn't realize that it stood for an acronym, or like it stood for laughing out loud. It's just like the thing people write. So they can get kind of passed through without knowledge of what the acronym stands for. Was I going to say something else about lol? Yeah, lol's really interesting because its history actually goes back to the 1980s. The first lol was written in the 80s, so it's like older than some people in this room. And there are people doubting how sincere the laughter is. As early as 2001, there's already in a book about internet linguistics, one of the books before mine, there was somebody doubting like how it's unclear how often people are really laughing out loud when they say this. And then since then it's some people still use it for genuine laughter, but that's becoming less common. I did a lol survey asking people, do you put it in all caps or not? Do you consider it, do you use it for genuine laughter? And people said, like, oh, I use this for, oh, here we go, here's the book. And people said, at this point, if I want to tell somebody that I'm sincerely laughing, I type, like, I'm actually laughing so hard right now, like I spit coffee on my keyboard. Like, they write out this full phrase, because any sort of abbreviation that you use is, like, potentially insincere, and it's only by writing out this full, like, like, I'm actually laughing so hard right now, or, like, really long thing that they think of it as, like, especially sincere. So, yes, these are slides. This is a book that I wrote about internet linguistics, which I don't think is on the books table here. If you go to the Argo bookshop in Montreal, who had a books table here last year, they have copies available, some of which are signed. If you happen to run into me with a copy of it, I'm happy to sign it. And if you want to do more linguistics, I also have a podcast called Lingthusiasm, which you are welcome to listen to as well. Some people already listen to the podcast. Excellent. Are there any? We've got a couple more minutes. Any other examples of bits of internet things? Yeah. Do you have a mic? Actually, you said something already. Maybe we'll go here first.
So this isn't like between languages, but it's sort of generational.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I had some family drama over text because I was planning this surprise for my mom, and my aunt was like, oh, I already told her, and gave me like the shrugging emoji,
Oh.
which to me means like F off. And so I was like, what is this? And I didn't realize that she was like a 45-year-old. Well, like, she's really like not on the internet at all or texting, and so it took a little bit of doing to figure out that was not the intent. And so I was wondering if you had encountered.
One of my favorite examples of that is the confusion over the face with tears of joy versus the loudly sobbing face emoji, which mean very different things. And yet there are several anecdotes that I have heard from various people about people using the face with tears of joy emoji, especially because, like, oh, it's crying, it must be sad. You're like, I'm going to give you some bad news with some face with tears of joy emoji. Your dog has died, and here's all these, like, laughing, smiling faces. And even the loudly sobbing emoji is at this point not quite genuine sadness. It's this kind of over-the-top sadness. And so again, if you don't necessarily want to be like, your dog has died loudly sobbing, because that would, again, not quite be what people want. But yeah, there's a lot of, it's really funny, and I go into this a lot more in the book, but like, there's a lot of narrative around emoji. Oh, they're pictures, so they must be this sort of universal thing. And yet there are so many miscommunications around emoji. A picture does not always stand for something clear and unambiguous, even when you're trying to navigate like an airport, which has all of these international signs, with iconic pictures on them. And yet if you don't have any languages in common, you're thinking, okay, so this is a person standing at a desk with a hat on. I'm not quite, is this customs? Is that what this stands for? Is this an information desk? So yeah, even in something where you can figure out, oh, this is a person with a desk, at a desk with a hat on, does that mean that it's actually stands for something as abstract of an idea as customs? I saw another question.
Do you know how well written memes translate? Like, not the picture ones, the one that you have like, say something, or like the rabbit, or like, is it too English specific because it was created in English and you need to know the reference to use it?
Yeah, I mean, that's an entire thing that I would love to see someone do a study on. I know that, like, there are memes in many languages. Like, languages do have memes, but, like, I would love to see a cross-linguistic survey of memes. I think they're really interesting. Do you have a thought?
So I don't know much about other languages, but I know in America, or at least in English, shooketh is a thing, or shook, kind of like to demonstrate if like someone is taken aback by something, or it's like surprised, like, oh my goodness, I'm shook.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the shooketh ending or the hoomst ending, people using like fake archaic forms but like making a word that's a more modern into an archaic form, which relies on a lot of like linguistic awareness even within a particular language. Like just because you may have learned, you know, very good English from a school doesn't mean they've necessarily taught you like archaic forms that no one is using anymore, which modern speakers have repurposed into this particular type of slang. Like that's quite an obscure thing for speakers to be doing, which, you know, makes it harder if you're approaching it from a second language perspective. Okay, I think we're out of time. I'm happy to keep talking about internet language with people if you see me, yeah, hope this helps.